The net came up empty again. The man pulled it from the gray water with hands that had done this 10,000 times before. He stood alone on the narrow beach where rock met surf, his boat a dark shape against the morning fog. The wind carried salt and cold. He coiled the net without hurry, without complaint. This was the rhythm of his life. He did not expect it to change. Then he saw them. Two figures moved along the coastal path above the cliffs. They walked unevenly, one supporting the other. Even from a distance he could see they were women. Their clothing was torn, their movements desperate. They stumbled on the loose stones. The stronger one glanced down toward the beach, her eyes scanning for something. For help, for mercy. The fisherman stood very still. In this land, strangers meant trouble. Strangers meant questions he could not answer. He had chosen this isolation, this quiet stretch of coast where no village claimed the ground and no lord demanded tribute. He had chosen to be forgotten. But he saw the way the injured woman's legs gave out. He saw her collapse against her companion. He saw the blood on the younger one's sleeve. The fisherman climbed the path. They did not speak his language. He did not speak theirs. But their eyes told him enough. They were exhausted. They were afraid. The taller one, dark-haired and defiant despite her wounds, kept one hand near her belt where a blade might have been. The younger one, lighter-haired and barely holding herself upright, watched him with a gaze that seemed to measure his soul. He gestured toward his shelter, a stone cottage built into the hillside above the beach. The dark-haired woman hesitated. Then she nodded. He gave them water first, then bread, then a place by the fire. They ate in silence, their eyes never leaving him. He did not ask questions. He did not try to speak. He simply turned back to his work, mending the net by the fading light. When night came, he slept outside beneath the stars, leaving them the warmth of the hearth. In the morning, he brought fish cooked over coals and set it before them without ceremony. The injured one was stronger now. She sat upright, her pale eyes clear. She spoke to her companion in a language of hard consonants and sharp edges. The dark-haired one replied, then looked at him. She touched her chest and said a word. Then she pointed to the other woman and said another. Names, perhaps. He did not offer his own. Names were part of the life he had left behind. 3 days passed this way. He fished, they rested. The younger one's wound began to heal. The older one's strength returned. They watched him constantly, but the suspicion in their eyes began to soften. On the 4th morning, he found marks in the sand below the cliffs, footprints, many of them, leading north along the coast, then doubling back. Someone had been here. Someone had been searching. He did not tell the women. He simply continued his routine, but he felt the change in the air. Something was coming. The fisherman had lived through war. He had seen what men did to each other when they believed their cause was just. He had walked away from that world, but he knew its language. He knew its signs. The tracks in the sand were the handwriting of violence. They spoke of pursuit. They spoke of unfinished business. That evening, as he gutted the day's catch outside the cottage, the dark-haired woman came to stand beside him. She knelt and took a fish from the pile, her movements practiced. She began to clean it with a small knife, working quickly and efficiently. They prepared the meal together in silence. It was the first time she had offered to help. When they ate, she watched him across the fire. Her expression was unreadable, but something had shifted. The younger woman slept early, exhausted from walking the perimeter of the cottage despite her injury. She was restless, always watching the horizon. On the 6th day, the fisherman saw the smoke. It rose from the north, thin and gray against the pale sky. Too much smoke for cooking fire, too deliberate for an accident, a signal. He stood on the cliff's edge and studied it. The women came to stand beside him. The younger one touched his arm and pointed. She said something in her language, her voice tight with urgency. The dark-haired one translated with gestures. Ships, many ships, coming. The fisherman understood then. These women were not simply travelers. They were not refugees fleeing some distant conflict. They were something else, something that mattered. and whoever had been searching for them was no longer searching in secret. That night, he heard the sound of oars in the water. He did not need to see them to know. The rhythm was disciplined, coordinated, war boats. He stood at the window of the cottage and watched the darkness. The women were awake now, tense and silent. The younger one gripped a piece of driftwood like a weapon. The dark-haired one stood by the door, her hand on the knife she had used to clean fish. The fisherman realized they expected him to betray them. They expected him to call out, to signal, to save himself. He did not move. The boats passed in the night. Their crews did not land. They were searching the coastline, methodical and patient. The fisherman waited until the sound of oars faded into the distance. Then he turned to the women. He pointed to the floor of the cottage, then to them. Stay hidden, stay quiet. The younger one studied his face for a long moment. Then she lowered the driftwood. The dark-haired one exhaled slowly. They had expected betrayal. They had received shelter instead.
In the morning, the fisherman left the cottage and walked north along the beach. He moved openly, visibly, dragging his net behind him. Let them see him. Let them see a solitary man doing what solitary men do. He fished for hours, catching nothing but casting again and again. When the sun reached its peak, he saw them. 3 boats pulled onto the sand half a mile up the coast. Men emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing leather and iron. They carried axes and long knives. They moved with the confidence of warriors who had never known defeat. One of them pointed toward the fisherman. 2 others began walking in his direction. He did not run. He pulled in his net and began walking toward them. They met on the empty beach. The warriors were young, their faces unmarked by doubt. They spoke in the same harsh language the women had used. When the fisherman shook his head, one of them switched to a broken version of his own tongue. They were looking for 2 women. They described them with precision. Enemies of their people, thieves, betrayers. The fisherman listened without expression. Then he shook his head again. He had seen no one. He was alone here, always alone. The warrior studied him with cold blue eyes. Then he turned and walked back to his companions. They spoke among themselves, gesturing toward the cliffs. One pointed south, another argued for continuing north. Finally, they returned to their boats, but they did not leave. They made camp on the beach, building fires and posting sentries. They were waiting, watching. The fisherman returned to his cottage as the sun began to set. The women were exactly where he had left them, hidden in the shadows. He brought them water and the last of the bread. The younger one touched his hand when he set the cup before her. It was a brief gesture, almost formal, but her eyes held something that might have been gratitude, might have been respect. That night, more boats arrived. The fisherman counted them from the cliff's edge. 10, 20, 50. They came from the north, in formation, their sails dark against the twilight. They did not land on the beach near his cottage, but farther up the coast, where the bay widened. He watched them anchor in deep water, their torches reflecting on the black surface of the sea. A fleet, an army. This was not a search party. This was an invasion. The younger woman stood beside him now. She was not hiding any more. She looked out at the ships and spoke softly in her own language. The fisherman did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. This was about her, all of it. Those ships had come because of who she was, because of what she represented. The dark-haired woman joined them on the cliff. She spoke rapidly to her companion, her voice urgent. The younger one replied with a single sharp word, "No." Then she turned to the fisherman and did something unexpected. She knelt. She placed both hands flat on the ground in front of him and bowed her head. It was a gesture of submission, of request, of something deeper than words. The dark-haired woman remained standing, her jaw tight. She did not kneel, but she watched the fisherman with eyes that asked the same question. Will you choose us, or will you choose yourself? The fisherman looked out at the ships. He counted the torches, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. These were not men who would negotiate. They were not men who would forgive. If he sheltered these women, he would become their enemy. If he surrendered them, he would become complicit in whatever fate awaited them. There was no middle path. There was no safety in silence. He had walked away from war. He had built a life defined by solitude, by simplicity, by the refusal to take sides. But the world had found him anyway. It always did. The younger woman raised her head. Her pale eyes reflected the distant fires. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness. Her face was all sharp lines and fierce conviction. Her hair, tangled and unwashed, still caught the fading light like spun gold. She wore the remnants of rich clothing, now torn and stained. She had been someone important. She still was. The fisherman made his choice. He gestured for them to follow him, not into the cottage, but down the cliff path toward the beach. They hesitated, confused. Then they obeyed. He led them to his boat, the small vessel he used for fishing. It was barely large enough for three. The dark-haired woman shook her head, pointing toward the fleet. They would be seen. They would be caught. The fisherman ignored her. He pushed the boat into the surf and climbed in. The women looked at each other. Then they climbed in after him. They rowed south, keeping close to the cliffs where the shadows were deepest. The water was calm, the night moonless. Behind them, the torches of the fleet burned like a city on the sea. Ahead, there was only darkness and the unknown. The younger woman sat in the bow, her hand trailing in the cold water. The dark-haired one sat amidships, her eyes on the receding shore. Neither spoke. They rowed for hours. The fisherman's arms burned, but he did not stop. When dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they reached a place he had not visited in years, a hidden inlet where a river met the sea. Dense forest came down to the water's edge. There were no paths here, no villages, no reason for anyone to come. He guided the boat onto the narrow beach and climbed out. The women followed. They were shivering now, soaked from sea spray and exhausted. The fisherman led them into the trees until they reached a small clearing. He pointed to the ground. "Rest here." Then he turned to leave. The younger woman caught his arm. She said something in her language, her voice breaking. The dark-haired one translated with gestures and broken words. They wanted to know why. Why had he helped them? Why had he risked everything? The fisherman looked at the younger woman. He saw the question in her eyes. He saw the need to understand, but he had no words that would satisfy her. He had made his choice not because of who she was, but because of who he needed to be. He had walked away from war, but he had not walked away from his humanity. He returned to the boat without answering.
The journey back was longer. The sun rose fully, exposing him on the open water. He rowed with steady strokes, his eyes on the distant cliffs. When he rounded the headland near his cottage, he saw them waiting. The warriors, dozens of them. They stood on the beach near his boat's usual landing place, their weapons drawn. They had discovered his absence. They had realized what it meant. The fisherman pulled the boat onto the sand. The warriors surrounded him immediately. Their leader, a massive man with a braided beard and scars across his forearms, stepped forward. He asked the question in the fisherman's language, his accent thick but understandable. Where were the women? The fisherman met his gaze and said nothing. The warrior struck him across the face. The fisherman fell to his knees in the sand. Blood filled his mouth. The warrior asked again, where were they? The fisherman spat blood and remained silent. They dragged him up the beach. They searched his cottage, tearing through his few possessions. They found the remnants of the women's presence, the makeshift bandages, the second sleeping place, the proof of his betrayal.
The warrior stood over him and spoke slowly, deliberately. They would find the women, they would kill them, and they would kill him for hiding them. It was just a matter of time. The fisherman looked up at the man. He saw the certainty in those cold eyes. He saw the cruelty that came from absolute conviction. These men believed they were righteous. They believed they were owed the blood they sought. The warrior raised his axe. Then a voice called out from the cliffs above, one of the sentries. He was pointing out to sea. The warrior lowered his axe and turned. The fisherman, still kneeling in the sand, followed his gaze. The horizon was black with ships. They came from the south, from the direction the fisherman had rowed in the night. Hundreds of them, more than the fleet in the bay, far more. Their sails were marked with symbols the fisherman did not recognize, but the warriors around him clearly did. He saw the color drain from the bearded man's face. He saw fear replace certainty. The younger woman had not been fleeing her enemies. She had been leading them away from her allies, and now those allies had found her trail. They had found the men who hunted her, and they had come for war. The warriors abandoned the fishermen. They ran for their boats, shouting orders. The camp erupted into chaos. Men scrambled to raise anchors, to ready weapons, to form some kind of defense. But the fishermen could see it was hopeless. The southern fleet was already moving into position, cutting off the bay. There would be no escape. There would be no negotiation. He stood slowly, wiping blood from his mouth. He walked away from the beach, back toward his cottage. No one stopped him. No one even noticed. He was irrelevant now. The great forces had arrived, and men like him did not matter in their calculations. But as he reached the door of his home, he saw movement on the cliff path. 2 figures descending. The women. They should have been miles away, hidden in the forest, but they had come back. The dark-haired one reached him first. She was breathing hard, her face flushed with exertion. Behind her, the younger woman moved with renewed strength, her injury forgotten. She looked at the fisherman, at the blood on his face, at the chaos on the beach below. Understanding passed between them without words. She reached into the folds of her torn clothing and withdrew something small, a ring. It was simple, made of dark metal with a single red stone. She pressed it into the fisherman's hand and closed his fingers around it. Then she said something in her language. The dark-haired one spoke the translation carefully. This ring carries her name, her protection, her debt. If he ever needed anything, he should show it to her people. They would know. They would remember. The fisherman tried to return it. He wanted nothing. He had helped them because it was right, not because he expected reward. But the younger woman stepped back, refusing to take it. She touched his face where the warrior had struck him. Her fingers were gentle. Then she turned and began walking down toward the beach, toward the gathering battle, toward her people. The dark-haired woman lingered a moment longer. She looked at the fisherman with something that might have been admiration, might have been pity. Then she followed her companion down the path. The fisherman watched them go. He watched as they reached the sand and raised their arms. He watched as the southern fleet launched smaller boats that raced toward shore. He watched as the 2 women were lifted into one of those boats and carried away from the beach, away from their hunters, away from the violence that was about to consume this coast. The battle that followed was brief and brutal. The fisherman did not watch it. He went inside his cottage and closed the door. He sat by the cold hearth and held the ring in his palm. He could hear the sounds of men dying. He could hear the clash of metal and the screams of the defeated. He had heard these sounds before, in another life. They had driven him to this isolated shore, and now they had found him again. When silence finally returned, it was the silence of the dead. The fisherman emerged from his cottage in the late afternoon. The beach was empty except for the wreckage, broken boats, scattered weapons, bodies pulled out by the tide. The southern fleet was gone. The northern warriors were gone. Only the gulls remained, circling and calling. He walked down to the water's edge. His boat was still there, overturned but intact. He righted it and checked for damage. It would still float,
It would still carry him. He could leave this place now, find another isolated stretch of coast, start again. But as he stood there, he felt the weight of the ring in his pocket. He took it out and studied it in the fading light. The red stone caught the sun like a drop of blood. This was not payment. It was not treasure. It was a promise, a connection, a reminder that his choice had mattered to someone.
The fisherman placed the ring on a leather cord and hung it around his neck. Then he dragged his boat into the water and began to row. Not south, where the women had gone, not north, where the warriors had come from, but out to sea, toward the open water where the fish gathered and the world was still simple. He cast his net as the sun set. The water was calm, the sky was clear, and for the first time in many years he did not feel alone. He had chosen integrity over safety. He had chosen compassion over isolation. The cost had been the peace he had built here. The reward was something smaller, but more enduring. The knowledge that when the moment came, he had not turned away. The net came up heavy with fish. He pulled it into the boat and began the work of sorting the catch. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. Blood still stained his shirt from the warrior's blow. Salt spray dampened his hair. The horizon was empty now. All the great ships vanished beyond the curve of the world. But the fishermen knew they were out there. The forces that shaped the fates of nations, the conflicts that consumed ordinary lives. They would come again, in different forms, wearing different faces, and when they did, he would have to choose again. He would always have to choose. He rowed back toward the shore as darkness fell. The cottage waited, small and solid, against the hillside. Tomorrow he would repair what had been broken. He would clean what had been stained. He would continue the work of living in a world that offered no guarantees, only moments where a man could be measured by what he did when no one was watching. The ring rested cold against his chest, a reminder forged in blood and mercy. He did not know if he would ever see the women again. He did not know if their people would remember his name or his deed, but he knew this. When the stranger came to his door, bleeding and afraid, he had not turned them away. And that single choice, small as a fishing boat on an endless sea, had been enough. The stars emerged one by one above the quiet water. The fisherman secured his boat and walked up the path to his home. He did not look back at the beach where men had died. He did not search the horizon for ships that would not return. He simply continued forward, carrying the weight of what he had done, the cost of what he had chosen, and the knowledge that some debts are paid not in gold or glory, but in the silent recognition of one human soul by another. The night settled over the coast. The waves continued their endless rhythm, and somewhere far out to sea, beyond the reach of torches or sails, the fisherman's choice rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water, its consequences spreading in ways he would never see, touching lives he would never know, proving that even the smallest act of mercy can alter the course of kingdoms.